April 12th, 1893. Salem, Massachusetts. The old colonial house had been in the Williams family for generations. Nestled on the outskirts of Salem, its weathered stone exterior stood like a relic of a forgotten time. Its large looming windows reflected the sun in jagged streaks, and its creaky wooden floors groaned under the weight of secrets too long buried. When Clara Williams inherited it from her great-aunt Margaret, she thought it would be charming to restore it to its former glory. Little did she know that some things, once uncovered, could never be forgotten. It was late autumn when Clara first stepped into the attic. She had been clearing out the dusty old space, hoping to find something of value or at least something sentimental. The floor was scattered with decaying boxes, cobweb trinkets, and an overwhelming musty scent that clung to her like a cold mist. As she sifted through the piles, her fingers brushed against something odd. A small leather-bound diary, its cover cracked and fragile from age, sat tucked behind an old portrait of her great-great-grandfather. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the edges, but the ink inside was perfectly legible, as if the words had been waiting all this time to be read. The diary belonged to a woman named Isabella Williams, an ancestor Clara had never heard much about. Curious, she took the book down to the parlor, where the dying light of the day cast long shadows across the room. She settled into the velvet armchair and began to read. The first few entries were mundane, recounting everyday life in the Victorian era. Isabella wrote about her husband, Edgar, and their daily routines in the large house. But as Clara flipped through the pages, something shifted. The tone of the entries grew darker, more paranoid. Isabella wrote of hearing strange noises at night, soft whispers coming from the walls, footsteps on the stairs when no one was home. She described a growing unease, as if she were being watched. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine, but she couldn't stop reading. The entries became more frantic. Isabella began seeing a man in the house. At first, it was just a shadow in her peripheral vision, a fleeting glimpse of a figure standing at the edge of her vision. But soon she began describing his presence in detail. The man was tall, with sunken eyes and pale skin, dressed in clothes too outdated even for their time. He appeared at night, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her as she slept. Clara's heart raced as she turned the pages, each new entry more terrifying than the last. Isabella's husband, Edgar, dismissed her fears, attributing her visions to the loneliness and isolation of their lives. But Isabella's descriptions grew increasingly vivid. She spoke of the man's cold breath against her skin, of waking up to find him sitting at her vanity, staring at her through the mirror. And then came the final chilling sentence in that particular entry. Edgar doesn't see him. He's not meant to. Clara snapped the diary shut, her breath quick and shallow. She glanced around the room, the weight of the house suddenly pressing down on her. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer than they should have. It was just a story, she told herself, an overactive imagination penned down in the loneliness of the past. But as she stood to head to bed, she heard it, the faintest of sounds, like a creak in the attic. She froze, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The sound stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt almost alive. Over the next few days, Clara couldn't shake the diary from her mind. She found herself thinking about Isabella constantly, wondering if the woman had ever found peace. The house, too, seemed different. Strange things began happening, small at first, almost insignificant. Items would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. The air grew colder in certain rooms, even though the weather had remained unchanged. One evening, Clara sat by the fire with a glass of wine, trying to relax, but her mind kept returning to the diary. Her hand twitched with the desire to open it again, to read more. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, she thought, a remnant of reading something unsettling before bed. She convinced herself to finish the diary and put it behind her once and for all. She flipped to the next entry, her fingers trembling. Isabella's words had become almost incoherent. She was losing sleep, tormented by the man's constant presence. He no longer simply watched her. He whispered things to her at night, terrible things about the house, about her husband, about a hidden truth buried deep within its walls. And then Clara reached the final, unnerving entry. I know now what he wants. The cellar, the smell of earth and decay. Edgar is hiding something. I must find out before it's too late. Clara stared at the page, her heart pounding in her chest. The cellar. She had never thought to explore it. It was just a storage space, dark and damp, likely filled with nothing but old furniture and forgotten tools. But now the word felt like an invitation, a sinister beckoning she couldn't resist. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but the steady rhythm of the steps, moving slowly, deliberately, grew louder. They stopped just outside her bedroom door. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the door, paralyzed with fear. The floor creaked and she heard it, the faintest whisper, like a voice calling her name. Without thinking, Clara bolted upright, grabbed the diary from her bedside table, and rushed out of the room. She headed for the cellar, compelled by something she couldn't explain, her heart hammering in her chest. The door to the cellar loomed before her, darker than the rest of the house, as if the shadows clung to it with intent. She opened the door and descended the stairs, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. As she reached the bottom, she noticed something she had never seen before, a small patch of disturbed ground in the corner. Her hands shook as she dropped to her knees and began digging with her bare hands. And then she felt it, something solid, something cold. Clara's fingers scraped against something hard, buried just beneath the thin layer of damp earth. She hesitated, dread creeping up her spine, but curiosity, no, compulsion, drove her to keep digging. With every handful of soil she pushed aside, a horrific sense of inevitability grew. This was what Isabella had written about. This was the secret that had been waiting, buried for over a century. Her hand finally touched cold metal. She brushed away the remaining dirt and unearthed a small, rusted chest. The lock, decayed with age, crumbled easily under her touch. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid, expecting to find something mundane, perhaps old documents or forgotten heirlooms. But what she found was far worse. Inside was a bundle of tattered cloth, stained and smelling faintly of decay. Clara gagged, covering her mouth with one hand as she unwrapped the fabric. There, nestled within, were bones. Small, delicate, and unmistakably human. A child's bones. Clara stumbled back, her mind reeling. She couldn't breathe. The cellar seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing down as if the house itself were alive, suffocating her with its secrets. She stared at the remains, her thoughts racing. A child, buried here, hidden, forgotten. Was this what Isabella had meant? Was this why the whispers had plagued her ancestor? As the weight of the discovery settled on her, the room grew colder, unnaturally so. Clara's breath fogged in the dim light, and suddenly, she wasn't alone. From the corner of her eye, she saw him, the man from Isabella's diary, the one with the sunken eyes and pale skin, dressed in old, tattered clothes that belonged to another century. He stood in the shadows watching her, his face expressionless, but his presence suffocating. The air around him seemed to distort, like heat rising from pavement, but cold, freezing cold. Clara's breath hitched. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her limbs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by invisible chains. The man didn't move. He simply watched her, his hollow eyes locked on hers. The cellar door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, jolting Clara back to her senses. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the diary tightly to her chest, her mind racing. She had to get out of there, out of the house. Whatever was happening, it was connected to the bones, to the diary, and to that man. As she reached the door, she heard it again. The whisper. This time it was clearer, more distinct. Find Edgar. Clara froze. The voice was not just in her head. It was real as the man who still stood in the corner, watching her every move. She glanced back, and for the briefest moment, she saw something different in the man's eyes. Pleading. Then just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished, leaving behind an unbearable silence. Her heart raced as she ran up the stairs and into the hallway, slamming the cellar door shut behind her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew what she had to do. Edgar. Isabella had written about her husband's secrets, and now Clara was certain those secrets were somehow tied to the bones in the cellar. She ran to the study where the family's genealogical records were stored. Frantically, she searched through the old papers, looking for anything related to Edgar Williams. Her fingers skimmed across old birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death notices until finally she found it. An old letter from Edgar to his wife, dated April 1893. Her eyes scanned the letter, heart pounding in her chest. The words on the page were heavy with guilt, and as Clara read, a horrifying realization dawned on her. "My dearest Isabella," it began, "I fear what I've done cannot be undone. The man, the stranger, he demanded a price, and I, in my desperation, gave it willingly. I could not bear to see our child suffer as he did. He promised our son would live, but it was a lie. The boy never survived the night." Clara's hands shook as she read on, the pieces falling into place. "I buried him in the cellar, beneath the earth, where no one would find him. The stranger, however, remains. He haunts these halls, whispering to me in the dark, and I fear he will never leave. I beg you, my love, do not follow where I have gone. Do not seek the truth of our boy's death. It will bring only madness and sorrow." The letter ended abruptly, as though Edgar had written it in haste, but it was enough. Clara now understood. The man from the diary, the one who haunted Isabella, was the stranger Edgar had made a deal with. But it wasn't just the loss of their child that had cursed the family. It was Edgar's choice to bury the truth, to hide the body rather than lay the boy to rest properly. The stranger had taken more than just their son. He had taken their peace. Clara felt a sudden heaviness in the air. The house was not just haunted by the spirit of their lost child. It was bound. To the stranger, the man who had promised life but delivered only death. She heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, approaching from the hallway. Clara's pulse quickened, but this time she didn't feel fear. She knew what had to be done. With the diary and the letter in hand, Clara descended the stairs one last time, back to the cellar. The man was there, waiting in the shadows, but she didn't flinch. She walked to the disturbed earth where the child's bones lay, and in a voice she barely recognized as her own, she spoke. "He is gone. You took him, but you won't have me." The shadows seemed to recoil, as if the very house was pulling back from her words. She placed the diary on the ground next to the bones, along with the letter, and whispered a soft prayer for the child who had been lost for so long. For a moment, everything went still. The coldness lifted, and the oppressive weight of the house seemed to ease. Clara felt the man's presence fading, dissolving into the darkness. When she finally stood and made her way up the stairs, the house felt different, lighter, as if a curse had been broken. But as Clara reached the front door and turned to take one last look at the old house, she heard it again, a faint whisper. This time, it was Isabella's voice. "Thank you." The door closed behind her, and the house fell silent once more.